but for Ulysses still?
Welcome everyone to this panel.
Lebanese.
Yes. People, rights, development, the recipe for peace. So we have the tall order to find the recipe for peace in 1 hour. But to help me, I have 7 leading figures who are focusing really on humanitarian assistance and are really present across the MENA region and beyond. And we'll really try to unpack everything that relates to the state of human security these days, when the threats to individuals, people, and communities are often really overshadowed by other threats to states, national security. And so, especially in a region like the MENA, where conflicts are becoming more prolonged, it's increasingly difficult really to operate. I'm really pleased to have these excellent speakers with me today. I would like to start with Mr. Francesco Rocca, President of the International Federation of the Red Cross. And really, if you could give us an idea of how has changed the work of the International Federation of Red Cross in MENA in the past years, especially after the pandemic. Thank you, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the question. It has changed a lot. The first, in a good sense, is that finally, after years of vacuum, after the World Humanitarian Summit in 2016, we talked about the local actors, the localization process, and finally, the role of the local actors through the COVID has been recognized. They have been the champions in dealing with the community needs, and they are able to reach the most difficult places, especially if you think in areas like Yemen, in Syria, so in Libya too. So this has been a real turning point for us. And on the other hand, the difficulty, especially in the recent months, has been the polarization of the aid. The polarization and the politicization of the aid. Just to be very frank, very honest on this, it is affecting our role, it is affecting our appeals and the ability to work and support the volunteers, the role of the volunteers at community level, without talking, of course, the historical problems that we had in countries like Syria. But if you think also about Lebanon and the crisis that the Lebanese people is living, so the potential collapse of the countries could trigger really something serious. So we are working hard through the Lebanese Red Cross, because the role of the International Federation is to support the national societies in the area, is to protect the most vulnerable and to reach those who are living the consequences of these social instabilities. And the other aspect that I would like to underline, just back to the COVID issue, is the trust. No? The more you are an expression of the community, so the more the local actors are really an expression and part of their own community, the more are able to build the trust and to have access. And during the COVID, this has been important. And this is just the Lebanese crisis reminded me about the role that the Lebanese Red Cross was able to play during the crisis, and being identified also by the several parties, plus the World Bank, to be the third-party monitor to overview the entire process of vaccination. And this has been another important achievement and change. So what we have built during the years in terms of working at community level with the several different ethnicities and religious differences has paid back in terms of building the trust. So these are the main points, more or less, that we are...
And I think that what you really pointed out is the important role of the local actors as enablers of your work on the field. And leading me to the second speaker, Paige Alexander, Chief Executive Officer at the Carter Center. It's a pleasure to have you here. And I would like just to ask you a question related to the mandate of the Carter Center, especially when it comes to the respect of human rights and alleviation of human suffering in the different contexts where you work.
Yeah, thank you. And much filling in what Francesco said, localization is such an important part of all of the work that we do. When the Carter Center started, President Carter looked out and said, you know, alleviating human suffering and human rights are two of the most important elements of the things that he wanted to work on after his presidency. And so when you come into 2022 and you look at what international organizations are capable of doing now, you know, there's a very clear role for state, for policymakers, for the federal level to come in, but those are usually very short-term interventions that deal primarily with security issues. International organizations, and like many of my colleagues up here, have a longer-term view. And so when you are going into countries, whether it's Sudan, whether it's Mali, you have this ability to have a longer-term goal. We've been in most of these places over 20 years. And because of that long-term intervention, it means that your credibility is much higher when you're trying to have conversations on the ground, when you're trying to do education programs. And especially with human rights, there are so many organizations that are actually talking about the polarization that are tied to a certain party or tied on one side or the other. And when you have an international organization that has that type of independence, it really is a game changer. So in Mali, we do this as the independent observer of the Algiers Peace Accord that was signed in 2015. And now in 2017, we were named as the independent observer. And for that reason, we now can go in and talk to both sides. And I think that addresses the polarization piece.
Excellent. And really, you raised the issue of trust also, which is a very difficult one to address. And speaking of that, I have the pleasure to have Lea Baroudi, who is the founder of March, an organization which deals with increasing challenges in governance, and the governance crisis that unfortunately Lebanon is facing. Can you share with us a bit what has been your experience of founding this organization?
Yes, sure. Thank you first for having me. So, as my colleague said here, so Lebanon has been undergoing a very tough crisis that is economical, but also, in my opinion, is extremely political. And the main root cause of this crisis is not economical. It is the sectarian divides that have been going on and that have resulted in a 15-year civil war back in 1975. And therefore, these sectarian divides, because Lebanon has 18 different religious communities that actually still fear each other now, today. And so even though war stopped, the conflict has not actually ended. Now, our work was mainly focused, so for the sake of this intervention, I'm going to focus on our work in Tripoli, which is the northern city of Lebanon, not far from the Syrian border, and which two neighborhoods, two very poor neighborhoods in it, because Tripoli is one of the poorest cities in the Mediterranean region. One Sunni and one Alawite neighborhoods have been undergoing their own version of Syria's civil war for years. Up until 2014, when there was an imposed ceasefire. And now the main problem that also added to it is that the youth from these neighborhoods not only were fighting each other, but many of them were also crossing the borders to fight in Syria along both sides, or to fight in Afghanistan, or to fight in Iraq before that. So our work in March focuses on working with these young men into a reintegration program that gives them an alternative. Now, when I first decided to work in Tripoli, I am not from Tripoli, I was extremely discouraged. And actually, people told me I was crazy to go into a city that is not mine, where I'm not even from their own religion, and I am a woman, so I would get killed. Actually, the project started with a very basic idea of trying to find a way to listen to them. And therefore, we had decided to do a theater play where we grouped 16 former fighters on the opposite of the front line to act in a play inspired by their lives. Now, I'm not going to lie and say it was all rosy. There was extreme challenges. When they would come to rehearsals, show up, they would come armed. We would search them, find razor blades under their tongues, knives in their socks, guns in their pockets. Anyway, these people saw each other as mortal enemies. It was normal. The demonization of the other is something very prevalent in our country. And so, but because our platform allowed them to share their stories, because they had to share their stories, the script had to be written, they realized they were much more alike than they thought, and the judgments were broken. And basically, out of this experience, I realized that the conflict root causes were not really ideological per se. And although there is a component related to human security and economical, but the main point is that these youth, and I think this is all across the board, longed for a sense of belonging, for identity, to be heard, and this was the material point that changed everything. So this program transformed into, we opened the cultural cafe and cultural space on the former demarcation line, and translated into a complete and holistic reintegration program, which provided them with vocational trainings, with education classes, with cultural exchanges, with psychological support, with interventions with the army to appease their fear of security institutions, and resulted at the end of the day in, we've been working so far with 350 former fighters, former youth who were incarcerated on terrorism charges. And the result I see makes me happy, but makes me sad at the same time. Because so many things could have been prevented when I see young men turning from fighters to artists, to cooks, to activists in their own community who are trying to make a change. It taught me one basic thing, is that we should not disregard how much fear of the other, how much a threat to one's identity, how much the need to belong and to matter are really drivers of conflict. Conflict is created more irrationally than it is rationally. And even though human security is important because it creates these emotions if they don't exist, fixing or addressing these issues is mainly related to providing an alternative to these communities for them to feel like they matter, like they're included, like they are listened to, and they are part of whatever decision is being taken.
Thank you for this very granular plunge into the reality of Tripoli and the reality of your work, which brings me to Alain Delétros, director of Geneva Call, and what it means, why it's so important to engage with non-state armed group.
Thank you. Well, I think what we just heard is showing why it is important, and I could not agree more than what you just said. I mean, Geneva Call, as you know, is basically, at the moment as we speak now, in all armed conflicts, with a few exceptions in Africa. And our mission is very simple to express, is to get out there, get in touch with armed non-state actors or armed groups, or many of them call themselves de facto authorities, and bring them to something very simple, respecting basic principles of international humanitarian law. And from there, we can build up. But I think what you just said is what we see everywhere. The irrationality of what is in their minds in many places, which is one point. But it's not only irrationality. I think in many places of the world, you see young people who feel completely estranged from the world that is built today. Even though we're talking about the Middle East, let's just take one example. You take 1,000 kilometers in Africa from the Gulf of Niger to the Horn of Africa. In this band of land, you have about 80% of the known reserves in oil and gas of Africa. You think of the young people living in this band of land. What kind of influence can they have on the money made? Basically zero. You put another phenomenon in there, which is the same in the Middle East. How many weapons are out there? And this is the responsibility a little bit of our countries, the Western countries. Yeah. We are the biggest exporters of weapons and small arms. Weapons are everywhere. You have people feeling estranged, you have weapons everywhere. And this is why, for me, and we see very clearly in the Middle East, this phenomenon of armed groups, de facto authorities, is growing. I think what we've seen in 2003 with the Bush administration attacking and invading another country, what we see today with Russia attacking, trying to invade another country, if I look at the trends of conflicts in the world, these two big wars are, in my views, a little bit an exception. The big trend are armed groups taking more and more space. You take the Middle East, the map of the Middle East, where states have no access to, is just drying. If we move slightly south of Libya, the map in the Sahel, where you have armed groups controlling big parts of the population, for instance, of Mali, more and more, and growing by the day, the population of a country like Burkina Faso, this is a trend that we cannot ignore. And maybe my call that I would do to states in this forum, which is very international, and we are very thankful to the government of Italy to organize that, states have to show examples. When you have states behaving as we see right now every night when you turn on your TV, what are the commanders telling us in the ground? I was just a few weeks ago visiting our operations in northwest Syria, okay? I met with 7 commanders who signed with Geneva Call a deed of commitment. They are respecting. We have our people there monitoring. And they tell me, yes, but we are armed groups. We are considered terrorists. What do you say about the states? Look at how the Syrian army behaves. Put on your TV, look at what is going on in Ukraine. So when states behave like this, they are basically, I'm sorry to be blunt, but spitting on international law. And for an outfit like Geneva Call, which goes out to people who are on the terrorist lists of the P5, who are on the terrorist list, for many of them, of the European Union, and we have to tell them to behave better than the parties to these international conventions, it's becoming very hard. First message. Second message, and it will be the last one, it is very important that when our, particularly Western democracies, pass legislation on counter-terrorism, that they have an exemption for humanitarian worker. Most of my colleagues, and slightly myself, could be indicted in many Western democracies for just talking with people who are on their terrorist list. And for us, what we make very clear to all these commanders when we engage with them, the fact that they engage with us will not change anything in their legal status. But of course, if you behave and you respect the law, people one day might sit down and be in agreement to talk with you on political issues, which we don't do. We never do that, right? We speak about how their obligation to respect civilians and how they wage war. And second, if you don't respect this, then you're a criminal. Whether you're a state or an armed group, you're a criminal. End of the story.
Thank you very much. And earlier in your intervention, you were talking about how the youth disenchantment is also a driver for armed mobilization, which brings me to Daniela Fattarella, the director of Save the Children. Many of these teenagers who mobilize in armed group have grown up in dire situation of governance. So can you tell us a bit, give us a glimpse of the work of Save the Children, especially in Syria, Northeast Syria, where you operate, and everywhere else in the region?
Yeah, so thank you very much, and there are a lot of interesting words that are coming up out of this panel, so I'll try to put mine, which is paradox. Because I think that actually we are living in a world of paradox. If I take the MENA region, we have 49 million children that are living in conflict zone. And this is the highest percentage comparing to any other region. But at the very same time, we are also assisting to a sort of normalization of conflicts and grave violations in countries like Yemen, Syria, and Palestine. And why so? And it has already been mentioned, because conflicts are very prolonged in time. And also because there is an opt-in, opt-out interest from international media and also from engagement. So we also assist an increase in impunity and a decrease in funding. So that's the paradox where children are living today. And if we are also thinking that we all have different role to play where we are talking about human security, at the very end there is a role for all of us, which is the one of protecting children and communities. And I come to another word which has been mentioned before, which is localization. So also we have done our best in the last years at Save the Children to really shift powers to children and communities, to be the one that can really participate and advocate for their own rights. So a lot have been done in terms of increasing campaign and advocacy capacities, as well as providing access to data and to platform for leverage change. And we have been assisting to a lot of dialogue coming up between children and duty bearers to make them accountable for their own rights. But then it comes to another paradox. When we assist this and we see it works, then we have a lot of shrinking space in terms of civil society. And also we really have to work with children and with national partners to be sure that nations, and that it has been mentioned right now, that states do have a say and take action in terms of fighting impunity and making perpetrators accountable. So we do need to have international, regional, and national mechanism of accountability that for children also really take into account the violation against children. And then I'll finish. And while we see that, actually, and I come to the Syria, we also have the paradox in some places in the world in which we see children not as vulnerable actors, but as security threats. Because in places where they are presumed or are associated with armed groups, they are not seen as victims, but again, human security is seen through the lens of security. And these children are caught in the middle. Thankfully, in northwest Syria, we have assisted to some positive developments because some of the children which were detained in camps have been repatriated because of the best child interest which has been taken into account. So a lot of paradox in the region where children are caught in, and the work in Save the Children is really to try to empower them, but especially to really find mechanisms for accountability, because impunity is becoming bigger and bigger.
Thank you very much, Daniela. And you said a very important thing about how human security is increasingly seen through the lens of security. And here I think we are touching an important point when it comes to the competing priorities. No? Is it more important human security? Is more important security? Is more important human rights? And here it leads me to Miro Modruzan, the Geneva representative of Intersos. And you have a special experience, especially in a specific difficult setting of operation like Afghanistan, where Intersos had to deal with the Taliban government. How did you balance the issue of human rights with the issue of humanitarian assistance?
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you for inviting us to be on the panel. Yes, that's a really very complex topic, and of course, I mean, maybe to start with the humanitarian approach. Of course, the humanitarian approach, our mandate as Intersos is to alleviate human suffering through principled humanitarian aid based on international humanitarian law. Of course, human rights equally important, but different in a sense that is more dealing with issues about defense and fulfillment of human rights, or perhaps looking into issues of preventing abuse of human rights, or looking into achieving justice and denouncing certain human rights issues. We at Intersos, of course, fully support human rights issues, but for us, the priority is, especially in complex crises such as Afghanistan, is to really focus on creating humanitarian space so that we can reach the most vulnerable and assist them. And in order to do so, just like the colleague from Geneva Call has mentioned, we have to, of course, engage with different belligerent parties to, for example, in the conflict areas. Of course, in case of the Taliban, we are very well aware of how difficult the situation is for Afghan people, and how detrimental the current policies of the Taliban are on people there. And of course, we know about their human rights. But at the same time, I think we need to recognize that even already before the Taliban came into power, the humanitarian situation has deteriorated really quite significantly in Afghanistan with the drought and so on. And then since the Taliban took over, we see that, for example, the international development assistance that Afghanistan was heavily dependent on, for example, for basic services like health sector, social services, etc., that was suspended. The liquidity crisis happened. We had frozen central Afghan banks' assets, which all created a really bad economic situation, resulting in basically bad humanitarian situation for the people. And just to illustrate from our own example, for example, in the region, the province of Zabul, which is quite a remote area of Afghanistan, we see in the first 6 months of this year a very steep increase in malnutrition of children, 70% compared to the same period in last year. In another district, which is even more remote, in Shai district, we see 90% of increase in severe malnutrition. These hospitals are really poorly equipped to deal with this terrible situation for people, and sometimes they have to put 2 to 3 kids into one bed just to help them. So this situation is prevalent in many parts of Afghanistan. So obviously, going back to the Taliban policies, so for us, we do not close our eyes in front of against the human rights issues, but we have to prioritize that the humanitarian access and humanitarian issues are basically their life saving. So we need to assist people to prevent further suffering and to actually prevent deaths, to be so blunt. And I think it's also important to say, I mean, we see a lot in the media about the rights of women, which, of course, they're bad. But if we look at, for example, if we would put any conditionality of humanitarian aid linked to the, let's say, reversal of Taliban policies, it is precisely women and children that would be the worst affected, and their situation would get worse.
Thank you very much. And you mentioned the need and the difficulties to create humanitarian space in a very hostile political setting. And speaking of which, I wanted to bring in Bo Victor Nylund, director of UNICEF, and how difficult is it to actually create that humanitarian space in a setting like Northeast Syria where you operate?
Thank you, Maria, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I think now, post-COVID, maybe speak to 3 examples about programming in a country like Syria, since this is one that we have been talking about quite a bit here today, and especially in the post-pandemic situation. So if we start with the learning poverty that we're witnessing, access to education, and especially since a country like Syria and many other countries in the region as well did not have access to digital learning and to materials that they would have been able to make use of during the pandemic when schools were closed. It has meant that so many children have dropped out, and also even those that go to school, the quality is so poor that children actually are not learning. We've done a global study recently where we see that in low and middle income countries, 2 out of 3 children at the age of 10 are not able to read a simple sentence. In a place like Syria, it's 9 out of 10 children at the age of 10 that are not able to just read something simple, even if they have been to school. So that's the learning poverty, and what does it mean for the country? Of course, that the human capital is very much at risk for the coming period and for rebuilding back the country. The second one I would like to speak to is the area of immunization, where, of course, for the last 2.5 years, a lot of the focus has been on COVID vaccination, both at the level of governments as well as at the level of families. And they have invested a lot to make sure that they are able to go to the health clinic to get those vaccines, which were not given to children. But what has happened is that now societies have fallen behind, and basically child vaccination has gone down dramatically over the last 2 years. We're focusing now a current study on bringing out the key messages and advocating around this issue. But similarly in Syria, we see that there are many children who are 0 dose now, have not had any vaccinations at all, or have under vaccination, so not received all of the needed vaccines during that time. And what that means in practice is, of course, that children fall sick, and some of the most serious diseases like measles are very tragic and can spread very quickly, and including across countries, because unfortunately the disease doesn't know borders either. Then finally, I wanted to speak to the issue that Daniela has mentioned, which is the radicalization element. And as you know, in the northeast of Syria, we've had the territorial fall of ISIS in 2019, and as a result, there were about 10,000 children that were rescued by the local authorities, by the Syrian Defense Forces, the Kurdish group, and now some of those children that came from about 60 countries altogether, so including in this region, but also from the Western world, South and East Asia. And over the past 3 years, only some 3,000 of those 9,000 have been repatriated. And there's an urgency to this situation because, of course, ISIS has been territorially defeated, but they're still lingering throughout Syria, in fact, and in parts of Iraq, but especially in the northeast of Syria. And we saw in end of January an attack on a prison where hundreds of prisoners were released by ISIS troops, but also the radicalization of these children and women who remain, for instance, in Al-Hol and Al-Rouj camp, is a serious threat. And so every day counts, and we need to make sure that these remaining children and mothers are repatriated as well.
Many thanks for this and this testimony, really. And I wanted to use the last 20 minutes we have really to reflect all together on how the mandate of your respective organizations that you lead and you are part of is going to change in the next year. Not is going to change, but what type of challenges it is going to face, because it seems to me really we are going to walk through a very difficult phase of history where it's increasingly difficult to speak to the other. And many of you have mentioned this challenge of actually creating space for humanitarian assistance or for action in contexts where there is political hostilities and where there is political polarization. As a geopolitical analyst, I can say that definitely we are going to face increasing polarization. People and states, you were mentioning states, are potentially going to be less inclined to speak to each other if they are standing on opposite sides. So how the mandates that you have, and what are the challenges that really are you going to face in the next year? And maybe we can take a turn from Mr. Alain Delétros in the order that you are sitting so that everyone can elaborate on this.
Thank you, Maria. I think for our work, you mentioned the main challenge. That is the chaos in which the international community is in this moment. I think for people of my generation, we've never seen that. That at the Security Council, I think even during the Cold War, it was more possible to get some discussions going on than it is today. You see, we heard in a panel this morning that in Europe, the OSCE is on the brink of disappearing because there is no dialogue going on there anymore. And for us, for our work concretely, engaging armed groups to convince them that they have to respect international humanitarian law, because whenever they raise in arms, they fall under this body of law, which gives them protection, but also obligations, and often they don't know that. But convincing these guys to behave, to speak a little bit like I used to speak to my children, when they see P5 behaving as we are seeing these days, it will be very difficult. So for me, what would do our job much easier is if these international conventions get enforced by real prosecutors who have real power, as we have seen, for instance, in the former Yugoslavia, as we have seen also in a place like Colombia, prosecutors who can go after the criminals. You cannot breach these conventions and nothing happens to you. And the example should come from Western democracies. This is a message I brought very often to our American and French friends, whose armies have been involved in wars where we are. you perfectly know that some of your soldiers did not respect. You have to try them. Otherwise, you're sending such a bad message to the rest of the world. But so for me, all these discussions that we are hearing today on top of the, how is it in English? La Cour Pénale Internationale, the International Criminal Court, right? The Rome status, basically, is essential. We cannot continue having strong conventions like the 4 Geneva Conventions, the additional protocols, the Ottawa Convention, the Hague Convention, and people spit on them publicly. You can see that every night on TV right now, and nothing happens. No, you go and have a drink of vodka afterwards, okay? Sorry. But so enforcement is essential. Otherwise, we are all singing songs that are totally useless.
Right. Paige?
So I'll take it from the top up to the bottom down. So enforcement is incredibly important, but I also think that working with the next generation, working with youth, working with civil society to make those norms understood. And so, in the work that the Carter Center does, we have a peace health nexus. And whether it was in 1993 in Sudan, when we did a guinea worm ceasefire and got both sides to talk to each other so we could get health packages through, which I know a number of our organizations have worked on, or whether it was Ebola in Libya or Sierra Leone, or whether what we're doing now in Mali and Sudan to actually use civil society organizations, use the youth, use the women to be having these conversations locally in their community, and then to bring that forward so the government officials have a checks and balance. They understand from the ground level that these are security issues that affect everybody at the village level, and how do you get this into policy? How do you get this into a place where you can get these health packages, where you can have rule of law and access to information for some of the more vulnerable populations to have access? I think that's where the policy and where on the ground meet.
Right. President Rocca?
Yeah, but first, let me tell you that I fully agree with Daniel Alain, on the need to implement the Geneva Convention. This is something that is badly needed, but in both sides, I would say, even when it comes about engaging in the dialogue with the armed groups, so they are not protected by the Geneva Convention. And one of the things that they always reply to us when we try to engage, to have access, think, for example, in Syria, we had a period in which we had to negotiate with more than 12 armed groups to reach our target to deliver. So imagine that one of the answers, why do we have, because of course our role and our delegates on the field, especially the colleagues of the ACRC, is try to disseminate the international humanitarian role and the importance to protect civilians. And then about the importance to treat with dignity, according to the Geneva Convention, the prisoner of war, but they are not recognized as them. So I think that this is mandatory to open the discussion. It's not an easy solution, but I think it's mandatory for the international community to open the discussion and create a real safe humanitarian space. Without this, it's impossible to create the humanitarian space. Second, the messages. Our colleagues, they were talking about Al-Hol. We know perfectly that many of the children that are in Al-Hol now are linked with countries in Europe that are championing officially the human rights, but they don't want to talk and to engage with this about the fate of these children. Or if you come about the politicization of the aid, no, and the inability of the humanitarian organization to deal with the resources. Many of our appeals are underfunded, while we are having a lot of resources to spend in Ukraine. This is marking also an important moment which we have having these difficulties, but the international community is marking like if we have a human being of A series and human being of B series. And think not only about MENA, think about what is happening now in the Horn of Africa. One child every minute in Somalia is hospitalized for malnutrition. And we are living in the same situation that we had in 1984, or what is happening in Syria, because we are areas we have acute malnutrition plus the other consequences of this so many compounded crises. So I think it's time to reopen, but in the short term, I'm not very optimistic. As humanitarian, I should be, because this is my role. But in the short term, it's very difficult. We are really sending the wrong messages to avoid the radicalization that we were talking before.
Yeah. Mr. Nylund?
Thank you, Maria. I think I would stay with the topic of the third country national children in the northeast of Syria and speak to the issue of polarization from that perspective. Now, over the past 4 years, the children mainly who have been repatriated are from the Western world and have been going through Iraq. Now, the remaining countries, the big numbers are from Middle East and from South Asia, East Asia, and from the Stans. What this means is that they have diplomatic relations with the government of Syria, and so we need to be able to facilitate repatriation through government areas. And the polarization with the war in Ukraine means that it's also become a sensitivity that is a cost for those children that are still lingering in the Northeast with very limited services, but above all, very much exposed to the radicalization elements, because make no mistake, ISIS is around those camps every day, and many of the movements around, but also many of the women are still also very much linked to ISIS in different ways. So it's just the urgency of the situation, and I find now is really an important moment when you talk about, okay, where are we heading? When it comes to this type of situation, that we need to learn from this experience. On the one hand, how can we prevent radicalization from happening in the future, and how can we learn from the reintegration process that is now taking place in the countries where those children and mothers have already gone back. And I would call for more study and research to go into that. We saw Human Rights Watch recently come out with a study on reintegration in some of the countries.
Right.
But it's something that we need to really make sure that we capture some lessons, because this is a time when there's still vulnerability of the world in terms of these children ending up in other situations, but also who knows what is around the corner, when we need to make sure that we prevent such behavior moving forward.
Thank you, Naren.
Yeah, I think that I would echo some of the things that have been mentioning. The very first one is really around access. So, I mean, I think that this is one of the big issues that we had, and actually this is a big issue because you cannot really implement a principle of humanitarian action if you don't have access. And also, I mean, just to make an example, in 2021 we had almost 4,000 incidents which were documented and reported. Almost 46% were occurring in Yemen, so only in one country, where, I mean, humanitarian access is denied in terms of really human actors are attacked or, I mean, there are interference in the distribution or stuff like that. And you see that when you can work, even in countries so difficult as Yemen, even in informal ways, you can really create a change. For example, at Save the Children, we really had positive example with Child Protection Committee, which were really informal ways of protecting children within the country. That's the first thing. The second thing, again, is immunity, which has been mentioned before. Unless you really put in place mechanisms that are really investigating and documenting the perpetrations and violations, and you have data that can be aggregated and disaggregated by sex, gender, and age, you cannot really fulfill the requirement or going behind perpetrators. So immunity increases, and then if you think that you will never be accused, then you go on with the very same crime. And the third point, which is very much close to Save the Children, let's say, action, is really child protection, which should be a cross-cutting element of all humanitarian activities. So it is true that you can have standalone activities to protect children, but to really make an effective protection of children, this has to be a cross-cutting issue throughout all the activities that are implemented in countries in conflict or in danger.
Many thanks, Daniela. Miro?
Thanks, Maria. Well, there are numerous challenges faced by humanitarian sector, and some of them are mentioned. Counterterrorism measures by Alain, politicization of aid by Francesco. You mentioned also access and insecurity. But I want to maybe just mention two kind of obvious things. We talk a lot for many, many years around the need for the humanitarian and development to work much more closely and in sort of closer collaboration to both address the growing needs that are obviously there and to kind of try to also address some of the root causes. But in my humble opinion, I think we don't really see much progress on that. We still see humanitarian actors are there on the front lines, they are addressing vulnerabilities, and I think development actors are not there, partly because of the way of working and kind of risk-averse approaches to their work. And the second is humanitarian funding. So the needs are growing for years and years and years, and I would say the humanitarian donors are generously contributing, but not at the same level to following the needs. Just yesterday in Geneva, the UN has launched the Global Humanitarian Overview for 2023, and it's over $50 billion for next year, which is something like 20-something,
51.
I don't know exactly, % increase. And the people in need, they estimate next year will be 339 million, which is one in every 23 person in the world. And that is, and compared to 2022, it's 65 million more people. At the same time, humanitarian funding that we saw for the appeals for 2022 were all, not all, but most of them are way below 50%, some of them as low as 35%. So I think this is one of the greatest challenges that we will be facing going forward.
Many thanks. Leah.
Thank you. So basically what I see as a main challenge anyway in Lebanon, but I think it applies all around the world, is that all the drivers of conflict and radicalization in our case, because of this increasing polarized world, are back. Why are they back? I completely agree with Alain on something very specific, which is injustice, feelings of injustice and double standards are main drivers of radicalization and conflict. And therefore, when it comes to the international community, when the international community comes and imposes or says, you know, these are human rights red lines, etc., and they do not act upon it, this increases conflict unknowingly and radicalization. That's one. Two, over-securitization, because in these periods of extreme polarization, there is over-securitization, or what we call sometimes counterterrorism, etc. These also inadvertently increase radicalization and conflict. And so it becomes a vicious circle. Now, also, Alain mentioned something about the role of the state, that the state has to be a model. The problem is that when the state is hijacked by people who thrive on division to stay in power, then what do you do? And then what is the role of the international communities and all of these conventions? Because this is a question that should be asked, because every time we talk about Lebanon, the answer is, you know, you have to, there are elections and you have to, you know, do your own change, etc. But this is actually not true. Our state is hijacked. So what do you do in that case? And what is the role, or should there be a role for the international community in that front? Also, I just want to say out of the lessons learned, because I honestly do believe that maybe I was going to say Maslow's got it a bit wrong, you know, the hierarchy of needs. In my opinion, I really do believe that human dignities and the need for self-actualization and to do something and to belong to something are needs that go beyond our basic needs when it comes to communities and community resilience. And therefore, we should not disregard this. And lastly, I want to also say that the challenge is that in order to have interventions that have impact, first of all, they have to be community-led and they cannot be imported. That's one. Listening, having empathy, but also these processes take time. And most of the time, when it comes to foreign interventions, these foreign interventions come on a short-term basis with no strategic vision, and this actually creates the opposite effect. And also, we need to understand that for things to happen, they need to take their time and they need to be endorsed by the people and by the communities slowly, and not push a trending agenda that is today, you know, we have to implement it now, we have to tick boxes, we have to make sure it's done, and then move on to something else, because this creates also a lot of negative impacts on the community.
Thank you, Leah. And I think that you really touch lastly on this very important concept of human dignity. Without human dignity, there is no peace, finally. So we connect back to the title of this session. And I really thank you all because you are on the field, you are present on the field. And honestly, having work also in field work, I think that this is really what is missing, knowledge of the field, and really these testimonies are extremely relevant to all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.